Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. I'm a mindfulness teacher, and this is a place where we talk about all things mindfulness. Now, if you've tuned in at all on any of the posts that I have or these podcasts, you know by now that mindfulness is a little more complicated than we might initially think it is. It can be helpful in your learning process to have some structure, to be able to look at particular topics that are of meaning and help to you with whatever's coming up for you in your life. Our guest today has done exactly that. So, come on, let's talk with our new friend. Our guest today is Oren Jay Sofer. Welcome so much. Good to see you again. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Ted. Really glad to be here.
Now, it's been a few years since we've last spoken, and this time we were talking about your current book, which I have here, and I've really appreciated going through this. Your Heart Was Made for This. And I'm always curious, what were some of the conditions leading you to write this new book?
Hmm. Sure. Well, I'd had the idea for it for a long time, a kind of practical guide to developing inner resources. It's a really accessible way to think about meditation and contemplative practice. I want to be more kind. I'd like to feel more patient. How do I cultivate gratitude? These are things I think that everyone recognizes the value of and can benefit from. So that seed was there. And then 2020 happened, which was such a tremendous upheaval for everyone in so many different ways, and not just the pandemic, George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter movement, changes in the ecological situation, the wildfires out west. So I started writing about inner resources and how we can have more courage, more hope, more stability inside with everything, with the ground shifting underneath our feet so quickly. And then that was the initial inspiration for the book, was my writing about that. And then when my wife and I got pregnant and decided to have a child, it took on a different meaning, a deeper meaning, looking ahead to the future generations and our son and the world he's inheriting, and really wanting to grapple with a question that has been important to me since my 20s, but in a deeper way, of what is the relationship between contemplative practice and social change, and how can our inner life play a role in the transformation of the outer world. So those are some of the things that inspired me to write it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And what's most interesting is I hear more and more a shift in mindfulness communities in general from a self-help, introspective, just me focus to that more socially engaged kind of thing, like we have seen for many years in Zen, for example, that Bernie Glassman used to do, and all the others, that mindfulness is not just for the individual. It's a team sport and can influence so many things above and beyond the individual. So thank you for that. I completely agree with you.
Mm.
And I noticed in the structure of the book, you mentioned this building capacity of different areas in one's life. And
Yeah.
it's not just one thing, it's many. So tell us a little bit about the sequential structure of the book.
Yeah, sure. What's neat about this book for me, and which was also a challenge in writing it, is that, and I'll get to the structure in a second, because the structure serves two purposes. There's going through the book in a sequential way, but then there's also, I wanted this book to be something that anyone can pick up and find something useful, and that you don't have to start at page one. Because life is messy, it's complicated, difficult things happen unexpectedly, and you might not want to read a chapter about mindfulness or concentration. You might need to read a chapter about forgiveness, which is the last chapter in the book. You might need to want to read a chapter about rest because you feel exhausted and burnt out, which is, I think, chapter 18. So I'll talk about the structure. And at the same time, as I say in the introduction, this book is meant to be a companion for people. And I hope that people will use it in a way that makes sense to them, and to find the things that they need in it at the time that's right for them, and to feel free to skip around. So one of the challenges of writing the book, so there are 26 chapters, each on a different positive quality or trait that can support us in these really challenging, rapidly changing times with so many different crises on so many different levels on the planet. They're 26 because if you take 2 weeks for each chapter, you get a whole year. So I wanted the chapters to be short enough that someone living a busy life, raising kids, working, can actually get through it, in an evening or two without feeling overwhelmed, and then have time to digest it and practice and explore and think about it. So each chapter is, maybe 10 pages, but I didn't want them to be superficial. I actually wanted to treat each quality in a careful, thoughtful, and deep way, and really look at, okay, we all know today gratitude's helpful, a lot of research behind it, makes you feel happier, but what is gratitude? And how can I be grateful in a world where there's so much suffering and violence? Like, I wanted to look at the difficult questions for each of these qualities. So that was the challenge in writing chapters that are short but still deep, accessible, and flexible. To get to your question about the structure, so the book, for those who kind of appreciate pedagogy, there's a lot happening in the structure.
Yeah.
So on one level, so there are these 4 parts to the book, right? And each of the parts goes through a cycle in deeper and deeper ways. So you can think about it kind of like as a spiral. You're going around the same process in deep and deepening ways. And that process, that cycle, is a particular pattern of development that is natural in the human psyche that we see in Buddhist pedagogy. If you look at all of the different lists that the Buddha used to teach the meditative process and the path to awakening, there's this particular arc of development where there are certain qualities that are foundational, that help us to arrive, that initiate energy, and that build toward a certain crescendo. There's a certain kind of a peak. And then from that peak, there's a kind of settling and an integration process that then results in some kind of freedom or release or contentment, a more of a profound understanding. And so that pattern, which is kind of a wave-like pattern, is mirrored in many different processes. So the idea was to take people through that cycle, that pattern, multiple times in order to get familiar with it. So each part is another pass through that pattern. The first part of the book lays down foundational qualities, and it starts with attention, which we can get into more if you want. It's like, if we can't pay attention, we are just at the whims of both our own habits and patterns, healthy or unhealthy, as well as at the sort of beck and call of social media and society's pressures. So it starts with attention and then looks at core capacities for contemplative practice, things like energy, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom. And these are relevant for the whole journey, which is why they're in part 1. So part 1 lays down foundations. Part 2 starts to take a deeper look at the energetic patternings of each quality and the progression of qualities. So we go through another cycle, and the reader is invited to pay attention to, how do you feel these in your body? How do you experience them? How does the energy move? The third part then invites the reader to look at these qualities as they relate to our friendships and relationships. How do we learn these from other people? How do we share and experience them with other people? And of course, each of these lenses applies to the whole book, right? But each pass through the cycle is an invitation to explore the qualities from a different perspective. And then the final part 4, looks at the question of home. What does it mean to be home, and how is the earth our home? And how does our understanding of a concept like home or refuge support us in the world today? And how can these qualities help us to discover our true home, our best home in the heart? So long, long answer, but it was a great question. So,
Well, one of the things I also noticed in this is that in each chapter, you also offer a reflection, a
mm-hmm,
meditation,
mm-hmm,
an action,
mm-hmm.
and if you have difficulties, I think is in most, if not all of them.
All of them,
And I
yes.
loved seeing that because it made it very practical.
Yeah.
Wonder if you might talk just a little bit about that. That structure is also throughout, and I think one of the most important aspects of the book.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Ted. And I'm glad you noticed that and mention it. So I need to give credit, and I do in the acknowledgments to one of my teachers, Ajahn Sachito. That particular structure is adapted from two of his books. He uses different aspects in different books. Um, and he was very, very kind to say, yeah, absolutely, go for it. So the idea here is twofold. One again is to ground this stuff in really tangible, pragmatic ways of living. So, you take a quality like joy, and it's nice to read about and think about, but how do we actually feel more joy? I think most people are interested in having more joy in their lives. So, how can we develop more joy? Well, it's helpful to actually take some time and first reflect on, what does joy mean to me? How have I experienced it? What gets in the way of feeling joy for me? To actually, use our intelligence to reflect on what we understand and know about ourselves and what we'd like to understand and know better. So each chapter has this invitation to some reflection questions that build on the themes of the chapter and invite the reader into a deeper exploration. Then there's a meditation. How do we actually take this quality into some way of silently deepening our felt experience of it internally? Many of the meditations are variations on a theme and emphasize a different aspect of the meditative process. Then the action section, as you pointed to, is, make it real, take it into your life. What can you actually do? What can we do in very concrete terms to nourish the seeds of joy in our hearts and in our lives and in our relationships? So there's some suggestions there. And then, of course, this stuff isn't easy, and different ones of us will struggle with different areas, but there are obstacles, there are barriers along the way. And so it's important to one, name some of those, to highlight some of the traps or pitfalls, to normalize it, and then to provide some encouragement and some guidance for, well, what do I do if I just, feel really depressed and overwhelmed and joy feels really far away? It's like, how do I deal with that? And it's like, well, that's a real experience. And maybe the first step is actually cultivating more compassion and rest, and finding ways to meet the experience you're having before cultivating joy, rather than trying to skip over it. So with each quality, there are different obstacles that can get in the way, and I wanted to make sure people had tools to work with those.
Yeah. Thank you. It made it particularly pragmatic in that it wasn't just I'm mindlessly absorbing information about things. There
Yeah,
is something for me to really absorb and connect with in my personal life, some
yeah.
practice that I have there. When I run into difficulties, what do I do? Because
Mm-hmm.
doing is a mode that exists for many of us.
Yeah, yeah.
So it brings home, and it was a really nice structure to see. So I'm glad you
Mm-hmm.
put that in there.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, this is a kind of a two-part question. As anyone who's written something large, whether it's a research project, a book, whatever it happens to be, there are usually, I think, if not inevitably, aspects where it touches us in a particular way.
Mm.
And so I wanted to ask for you, Oren, what were some of the areas where you found it personally very interesting in your
Mm-hmm.
own practice as you're writing
Mm-hmm.
the book. And also the second part, what were some areas that for you were maybe a little more challenging, or areas where like, I wonder a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more about that. I might be seeing it in a different way.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. So just to make sure I'm getting the question, it's what what were the areas that were particularly interesting for me
Mm-hmm.
to write about, and were there, or what were the areas of challenge for me that, pushed me a little
Exactly.
bit, or yeah, great. So um there were definitely chapters that were easier to write than others. Um and what I would say, so the chapters that interested me the most, where I feel like I really learned something, and I appreciated that I wrote the chapter, were chapters like renunciation,
Mm.
which is not an unfamiliar concept to me. I mean, I was in robes for 2.5 years. I've been practicing Buddhism for almost 25 years, um, more than 25 years now. And yet, really trying to make this accessible and practical, and also to grapple with what is the relationship between individual renunciation and social change when the forces we are dealing with are systemic, such that, one of the things that is so frightening and I think overwhelming about the ecological crisis is that it is very clear that individual choices are not going to move the needle. It doesn't matter if we, bike over individually, biking versus driving your car, or recycling or not, are not going to make enough of an impact on the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So then what is the value of renunciation if that's the case? So this was a very difficult and interesting question for me to grapple with. I had a lot of really rich conversations with several colleagues about it. So that's one example. Other chapters that bore a similar quality of deep investigation and learning were the chapters on patience. Um, Again, what is the role of patience in relation to injustice? How do those relate? The chapter on devotion. How do we understand devotion in a secular context? And I don't know what the proper term is, but Nietzsche said God's dead. So what does devotion mean, right? Like in this sort of um, post-religious world, you can say that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those are some of the ones that stand out. The chapters that were difficult to write, um, I'll talk about maybe two. So one is the chapter on play, and I tend to be more serious. It's just my personality, my character. I tend to be more intellectual. This is part of my conditioning, both sort of socially and personally. And I feel much more comfortable talking about suffering and, trying to make jokes. But I am a playful guy. I mean, I keep my NBC puppets and my, giraffe ears right here to keep things light, but I talk about in the chapter, like I used to have a clown nose. I actually went to clown school, but I dropped out. I couldn't hang. It was too hard. I lost my clown nose. Can't find it anymore. My grandmother was a clown, so it's in my roots. So, I wrote the chapter, and then one of my editors said, this feels a little bit serious, Oren. Like, where's the play? So that was fun. It was fun to go back and really push myself, and let's make this chapter more playful and
Yeah.
really look at, where am I stuck around this? So that's one. And then the chapter on equanimity. Um, I think you know from having read some, at least some of the book, if not all of it, that I lost my father suddenly before the book came out. In the very final stages of editing, it was actually the manuscript was done, um, and I had to make some changes. Um, And one of the two of the chapters where there were changes were mindfulness, equanimity, and then the forgiveness chapter, because I learned certain things when he died that I hadn't seen before about ways that I was lacking in equanimity in our relationship, in ways that I was still pulling away or withholding love because I was in pain
Mhm.
and I wasn't able to fully embrace or accept my own pain or his. And so that was very humbling, very important lessons for me. And I needed that to be in the book. It felt really essential just to have a sense of integrity and to honor his memory and the beauty of our relationship. We were very close. So that was another difficult part of the book for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's itself a very good segue to my next to last question.
Yeah.
You've worked with so many people over the years and helped so many people in providing some openings for them to land with mindfulness with their own lives in so many
Yeah.
different ways. I'm wondering what some of the difficult aspects you commonly see for people with their, for want of a better phrase, interconnected growing, which is what I see throughout this book. What are some things that they tend to run into when they're trying to have that their own presence in their own lives? What are some of the things that get in the way?
Hmm. Yeah, so just kind of in general, what are some of the common obstacles folks encounter just on the journey
Mm-hmm.
towards um, self-realization and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's a big question.
You're up for it. I know you're up for it.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, there's so many, aren't there? And I guess the first thing that comes to mind, Ted, is that very sort of sadly and poignantly, like what those obstacles are, um, vary based on social inequity.
Mhm.
So, for example, the kind of I think we all have experienced trauma. I don't think it's possible to be alive on the planet today and not have experienced some trauma, even if it's not direct personal trauma. There's this kind of vicarious trauma of the sort of violence of colonialism and modern history, and the ecological situation is a certain kind of trauma. But there's a lot of research just around ACEs, uh, adverse childhood early experiences, and how that affects our whole life. And so, where we are born, the level of access we have to resources, this will determine a lot to a large degree the kinds of obstacles we're facing. From just very real practical obstacles of externally, like, do we have access to clean drinking water and power?
Yeah.
Are we being bombed? Do we have a bomb shelter if we're being bombed? Like, there's just like all these layers of sort of privilege and safety and so forth. So that's the sort of the largest frame, I think, for me in terms of obstacles, is just recognizing how supportive are the external conditions of our life and how does that relate to the structures of our society and inequity and injustice.
Mhm.
Um, on the internal level, the next layer, I think, is trauma, and the degree to which we have been exposed to trauma and been able to metabolize it or not. I think this is a very common obstacle, and it varies from person to person, from population to population, based on a lot of different factors. Those who suffer from trauma, particularly acute trauma, there are very specific ways of practicing that are important, in order to not re-traumatize ourselves. And the whole book is trauma informed, takes a trauma informed approach. I talk about some of those principles in the introduction, things like, orienting, starting from a sense of relative safety and wholeness, going small, starting small, pendulating, moving back and forth between things that are difficult and supportive. Then I think some of the other common obstacles that folks tend to encounter, I mean, one of the most universal and tenacious is habit, just the tyranny of habit internally, the strength of our unhealthy habits, mentally, emotionally, physically. We're addicted. We are addicted to pleasure. We're addicted to craving. Many of us are addicted to work, to sense of identifying our self-worth with accomplishment, role, things like that. So there are these very deep patterns and habits in the psyche. And the strength of those patterns is an obstacle. And this is one of the central frames of the book, is this: how do we reroute the energy of those habits? And I use the metaphor of water flowing down a hillside. And water flowing down a hillside is going to carve a track, right? It's going to carve a stream bed. And so we're trying to redirect the flow of that energy, that life energy, from the neural networks that we have been giving preference to our whole life that are not helping us, to creating new pathways and strengthening them. So the whole book is kind of a process for doing that. And then there are particular habits and obstacles that people fall into. I think the Buddha's structure of the 5 hindrances is a very useful one to consider when looking at obstacles. And these are craving, wanting, which can be anything from like just wanting pleasure, I want to watch some entertainment, I want to nibble on something good, to craving for praise, being seen, getting the promotion or the thing. And really important, of course, to acknowledge that there's healthy desire. It's not that having goals is problematic, but it's this kind of obsessive hankering for something to fill us up. And then there's aversion, which is the opposite, which is kind of feeling prickly and sour, something I'm very familiar with. I'm an aversive type. My wife and I were just we talk about this a lot because she's an aversive type too, but she's not as aversive as I am. So it bugs her. So we were looking at a holiday card someone sent this morning at breakfast, and it was a very nice holiday card. And one of the things that I noticed and pointed out, I was like, oh, it's really hard to read the text with that print background. They chose the wrong background. Like, that's not, that's not helpful. And she's like, yep, that's your version. So it's a habit, What do we notice? We notice the things I don't like, the things that are wrong, things that could be better. So this kind of reactivity to things that we don't like, things that are unpleasant. So these are 2 very powerful obstacles that we all have. There's a very deep-rooted pattern in the psyche of, chasing after pleasure and avoiding pain. Then there's the 2 obstacles of dysfunctional relationships with energy, both physical energy and mental, emotional energy, of restlessness on the body, worry in the mind, and the opposite side, which is kind of lethargy in the body, just feeling depleted, burned out, exhausted. And then the mental, emotional component of that, there's a mental component of burnout, but then there's just a sense of just like apathetic, just I don't want to do it, I can't, I don't care. These are another set of obstacles, restlessness, and then kind of lack of energy. And then the last is doubt, self-doubt, not believing in ourselves, hopelessness, loss of faith in humanity, in any possibility. So these are all really powerful obstacles. And then the book, works with these and addresses them in different ways. So like, the chapter on aspiration talks about doubt very directly. Chapter on craving talks about chapter on renunciation talks about craving very directly. But they show up in other ways because a lot of these qualities are really antidotes. They're medicines that provide us another way through these obstacles in our lives. Yeah.
So one more question before we let you go for the day
Yeah.
is, if you're speaking with someone who is considering looking at this, what would be one thing you'd like to share with them for their consideration?
Like someone was like, "Oh, should I pick up that book?"
Yeah.
I should probably know the answer to this. I think it's just really a question, Ted, of like, what do you want? What do you want in your life? And do you have the tools you need to get there? This book is about how we live. And my aim is to provide people with the right tools to realize their hopes and aspirations and dreams, and the most solid inner foundation to make a positive difference in our world.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
Beautifully said, Oren. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Ted. Yeah, great questions. I love talking to you about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So for those of you who are watching again, your heart was made for this. And I do encourage you to check this out because there is so much wonderful content there. Our guest today, Oren Jay Sofer. Oren, thank you so much for being here today. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Ted. Great to talk.
Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you got something out of today's episode. Remember, if you subscribe, it doesn't just help you, it helps others to find this podcast, so please feel free to share this widely. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time.